Good evening and welcome to the city's second Climate and Environmental Action Plan stakeholder meeting. I'm Helen Cox, the Sustainability Division Manager for the city, and joining me this evening are John Brooks, our Senior Sustainability Analyst, and a number of other city staff, some of whom will be presenting tonight, including Kathy Naum, our Transportation Planner, and Mike Hauser, our Transit Manager. Also here this evening are Walker Wells, a principal at Ramey & Associates, our consultants on this project, and Sammy Taylor, also staff from Ramey. Thank you to all of you for attending. As I mentioned, we have a large number of public participants, together with our stakeholder group. And with that in mind, I'd like to remind everyone to keep their microphones muted unless you're called upon to speak, so we can minimize background noise. We're also asking the members of the stakeholder group to rename their profile inside Zoom for this meeting by adding the letters CAP or CEAP in front of their names so we can better identify them. This is our agenda for tonight. We'll be presenting some background information both on the community's greenhouse gas emissions, particularly as they relate to transport, and also on the city's active transportation plan and transit service. We'll then present and discuss ways of reducing transportation emissions through lower or zero emission vehicles and through reducing vehicle miles traveled, or VMT as it's known. To drive our discussion this evening, we'll review the stakeholder transportation related suggestions that were offered through an interactive map that we'll share. This map will be made available to the public to participate following tonight's meeting. There'll be an opportunity for participation during this evening's meeting in a scheduled discussion and public comment period, as well as through our polls, which we'll be sharing throughout the evening. We're asking everyone to stay muted unless called upon to speak. We've found that Zoom meetings to be more participatory if people turn on their cameras, particularly during discussion sessions. You'll find the controls for turning on and off your microphone and camera at the bottom left of your screen as indicated here. To ask a question, please do so in one of the following ways. You can open the participant window and choose the raise hand icon. However, different versions of Zoom seem to have this feature differently enabled. If you can't find the raise hand feature, you should be able to see a reaction button down the bottom of your screen. You can simply use the reaction button and choose one of those reactions to get our attention when you'd like to speak or ask a question. So you can also ask questions at any time through using the chat feature. You just press on the chat and you can type in a question to everyone or to a particular person. Usually nice to have a chat feature that goes around to everybody. And our staff, including our transit and transportation staff, will be able to address those questions as they come up. We'll try to identify the right person. So that should be ongoing throughout the evening. Okay. So let's kick this off with a quick poll, and please share your answers here on the poll that you see displayed before you. So you may have to scroll down to get access to all the questions. I believe there are 4 different questions, and we will share the results.
And it is anonymous, so you can answer honestly.
Right. Sorry. Oh, I should also mention that the meeting is being recorded. So I just wanted to let you know that. But yes, the polls are all anonymous.
About halfway through the voting, 33 of 55 so far.
Yeah, give it another
Well,
minute or so.
yeah, and the co-host won't be voting, so it'll be a little short of that, probably low 40s.
Okay, we might be good. John, you want to share?
Yep, here we go. So we're going to end the polling and push it up here. Let's open this. Oh, well,
Can you share the results? I'll share the results.
Oh, it's just opening it up a little bit. So we do have some folks that are out getting out there walking.
How many times a month? Yes. Pretty even distribution actually there. The number of times people walk to a destination. A third of people do not, which is not really surprising given the layout of the city. Good to see that people are walking more than they were. So almost half the people are walking to destinations now when they weren't before. And in terms of using public transit, not surprisingly, as Mike will reflect on, 77% of people do not use public transit, with maybe about 4 people who do, or maybe 6. As far as bicycling, it looks like about half the people do not bike, and the rest mostly use it about the same as they were before. Okay, thank you. Well, that helps to set the stage for how we might move the city forward on alternative transportation. But firstly, I'm going to hand over to Sammy to discuss some of the background in terms of the state's regulations on transportation. So over to you, Sammy.
Thanks, Helen, and you can go to the next slide. Okay, great. So as you can see from this kind of laundry list of state policies, we're really analyzing transportation emissions and developing potential mitigation strategies within this regulatory framework, which are pretty much crowned by SB 32, which is the goal to reduce emissions statewide 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And you can see on the graph to the right that the state knows that transportation emissions are one of the greatest contributors to emission for the state as a whole and for individual communities. And Helen will get into the breakdown of Thousand Oaks specific transportation emissions, but for the state as a whole, transportation emissions make up 40% of the state's GHG profile. So with that in mind, the state has developed several policies to reduce emissions and encourage alternative methods of transit, apart from single occupancy vehicles, which are a large contributor to emissions, especially at the community level. And these policies focus on transportation efficiency improvements, regional transit, and land use and housing guidance. So this list here is some of the more important state policies that affect local emissions and are accounted for in our local GHG inventories, which Helen will get into. And there are also some policies that kind of help shape local policies. So we can not only use these as guidance in what we're required to do and what the region is required to do, but what we can kind of see moving forward. So a couple of the big ones I mentioned were the Ghg Reduction Goals, SB 32, AB 1358, is a complete streets policy, which means you design streets not only to accommodate cars, but to make other multimodal transportation safe for everyone. SB 375, which is a regional sustainable community strategy, which is usually taken on by regional government levels of government to reduce vehicle emissions. SB 743 was a bill that changes how cities account for transportation impacts in new development. So it replaces the level of service analysis with the vehicle miles traveled analysis, which Helen will speak about. The Padley Clean Car Standards are vehicle efficiency standards for tailpipe emissions. CalGreen is the state building code that requires design requirements for EV construction in new construction, EV chargers, excuse me, in new construction. And then the newest one we have is an executive order from Governor Newsom that will require 100% of in-state vehicle sales be zero emission vehicles, so EV hydrogen fuel cell cars by 2035. Back to you, Helen.
Okay, thank you. So yes, we all hear the acronym VMT quite a bit this evening. VMT stands for Vehicle Miles Traveled. It's the measure by which the state looks at transportation impacts, the impacts on transportation from new development. So here I'm showing our greenhouse gas emissions, the city's greenhouse gas inventory, which I did show in our last meeting. And this documents the quantity of emissions of the gases that are responsible for climate change, together with projections running out to 2050. And what I'm showing here is what's called a business as usual model, BAU, business as usual. And what that means is we're not assuming any specific further mitigation actions taken by the city. So you can see at the bottom here in orange, transportation makes up approximately 50% of our emissions, then the electricity sector in yellow, then the natural gas in brown, followed by some more minor sources. A significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from electricity, you can see here in the yellow area that took place over the last 2 years, and due to the switch to Clean Power Alliance as the community's default provider at 100% renewable energy that occurred in early 2019. So in this business as usual scenario, emissions are projected to be 28% below 2010 values. And we're using 2010 as our baseline. That's as far back as the city has good, reliable data on all of these sources. So we're looking at emissions about 28% below that value by 2030. And then increasing slightly projected out to 2050, just scaled by expected population growth. As we discussed in our last meeting, since the electricity emission sector has been largely realized, the reductions in emissions due to that have largely been realized. The remaining ways to achieve significant further reductions are to address the transportation and the natural gas sectors. And we're here tonight obviously to discuss the strategies that we can take to reduce our transportation emissions. So what I'm showing here is a slightly different version of those projections. We're looking at projections predicated on successful implementation of various state legislative actions, including the attainment of those standards. So what this model does is it accounts for the greening of the electricity grid, which affects those community members who are purchasing electricity from SCE, as opposed to Clean Power Alliance. It also reflects a reduction in fluorocarbon emissions. Those are the emissions marked here in red, the HFC, PFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons, or the hydrofluorocarbons that are mainly used as fire retardants, aerosols, etc. So there are some policies in the state to reduce those emissions. We, as a community, we really don't have very much control over those directly. So it does reflect the changes in those policies, but mostly the significant changes you'll see down there in transportation at the bottom in orange are a result of the low emission vehicle regulations in the state. And those low emission regulations are projected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from new vehicles to 40% below 2012 values for vehicle models by 2025. So that's those clean air standards have a significant impact, obviously. So the 2030 emission projection shown here achieves a 44% reduction over the 2010 values, which actually is in line with what our preliminary targets are. However, it does fall short of meeting the 2045 or 2050 targets of being close to carbon neutral. And as you can see, there's a steep decline in transportation emissions anticipated for the next decade, but gains are fewer beyond that. So clearly we're on track to achieve 2030 goals, and that is with the caveat that provided that there's adequate support for those legislative targets to be realized, and also noting that the state's targets are inherently optimistic. But we really do need to focus on those longer term goals. Transportation plans and projects are inherently long term, so it's time to start thinking now about how we want transportation in the city to look like a couple of decades from now. This breakdown shows the annual vehicle miles traveled in the city by vehicle type. And as you can see, over 50% of the miles are from passenger cars and another 25% from light duty trucks. So that's also almost 80% of miles from largely personal vehicles. And there's some data there on the miles driven in and out of the city daily. So when we compare that with other cities in the county, you can see that the vehicle miles traveled here are higher than elsewhere. And this is the vehicle miles per population, so per capita. Here we're looking at numbers of around 11,000, a little bit less, 1,000, 10% or so less in Simi Valley, considerably less in Ventura, and even less in Oxnard. And in fact, recently, an article in the San Francisco Examiner last week identified Thousand Oaks as one of the 5 cities in California with the highest auto insurance rates, saying that the residents of Thousand Oaks grind out some of the highest daily miles traveled in the state. So that's an interesting data point for us to think about. Here we're showing the breakdown of vehicle types for vehicles registered in Thousand Oaks. So currently the city has about 3% zero emission vehicles registered. That's the battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles, primarily a few fuel cell vehicles. The state expects us to reach a target of 15% of all vehicles by 2030. But clearly we're on the right path, but there's a long way to go. As far as transit goes, the city operates buses 6 days a week on 5 different routes that now intersect at the Oaks Mall, allowing transfers between the different routes. Unfortunately, buses run relatively infrequently, circulating every hour. As far as provisions for bus riders, about half of the bus stops have seating, and about 25% of them have full shelter. Okay, we're going to share a second poll at this point. So John, I don't know if you have access to that. Maybe we could share a second set of questions.
Yep, here we go. I'm going to launch the polling. So do you see that at this point?
Yes.
There's one person that indicated they couldn't see the poll last time. I'm not sure if that's a pop-up window or something else that might interfere with it. I've not heard of that before. Seems like we're getting pretty rapid response here. I did get a message at work this time. It looks like we're at 54 and stable. So I'm going to end the polling and share the results.
Okay, so we have 83% of people who haven't taken a TO transit probably ever, I'm guessing, so those last 5 years. And a few people have taken it to travel outside the city. Actually, 20%. That's,
I think that's pretty good, actually.
that's not bad. Yeah, so there are some data points for you, Mike. Mike is our transit manager who's listening in tonight.
These are actually surprisingly high numbers relative to some of our other surveying in terms of ridership.
It may reflect our
Okay.
audience not being general public. So I'm going to stop to share results.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So now I'm going to hand it over to Kathy Now. She is our transportation planner. If I can actually, I'm having a little bit of trouble. Okay. Okay, Kathy, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Again, I'm Kathy Now. I'm the city's transportation planner. I'm also the city's bicycle coordinator. And I want to let anyone know, anytime you have any issues or concerns or suggestions related to bicycle, walking, anything active transportation, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I facilitate the city's bicycle advisory team, which one of the members here today, Linda, is has been sitting on for several years. And we're always looking for new people to be part of the bicycle advisory team. So with that, what I'm going to be talking about is the city's 2019 active transportation plan. It was approved by the council in 2019, and it combined the existing 2005 bicycle master plan, and then we also incorporated active transportation, which primarily includes pedestrians. So in preparation of the plan, what we looked at is where do people go and how comfortable are they getting there on bikes and walking? And so it looked at attractors, like where are people going? Are they going to shopping centers, parks, schools, bus stops? And then the idea of where are they coming from, which we call a generator, would be like where families live or where seniors live. It also had layers that included household income, vehicle ownership. They looked at barriers for cyclists, such as roads that have high speeds, lack of bicycle facilities, collision data, how steep the slopes are on the streets. And then for pedestrians, they looked at the speeds on the street, because people don't want to walk on streets that have high speeds, missing sidewalks and ramps, and also including collision data and major crossings and street slopes. Next slide. So taking that laundry list of all the information through the attractors and generators and everything else I mentioned, using a GIS mapping map, where in the city has the highest propensity for people to bicycle? Basically, where do they want to bicycle? And then by identifying where people want to bicycle and walk, there's other maps, then we can look at what improvements need to be done on those facilities and then prioritize those improvements. On this map, you can, it's really clear that the darker red is where people really want to bike more, based on the tractors and also the generators that are closer to Hillcrest and Thousand Oaks Boulevard. So that gave us an opportunity to identify projects and prioritize them in that area. Okay, next slide. And this is the pedestrian activity map. So you can see it's throughout the city, there's areas that people have a higher propensity to walk, which is on the more major thoroughfares. But just like bicycling, it's really in the downtown core that there's you have more density of people and more businesses that people would like to walk to. Okay, next slide. So included in the active transportation plan is a list of improvements, and there's maps that, so you can see on a map where the improvements are located. It identifies what the cost of the improvements are, and then there's information on funding sources. And so I just snipped a little part of one of the tables to give you an idea. Like, these are 4 projects, that one that's already been complete and 3 projects that are currently in design and construction. And what's also really, I consider relevant about this table is how expensive these projects are for very little mileage, because the cost to improve bicycle and sidewalk facilities is just very expensive. What you see in the picture is South Rancho Road. It'll connect a sidewalk between Thousand Oaks Boulevard and the Transportation Center, and there'll be buffered bike lanes also installed on it. And so the Caneo School Road project, which goes from Hillcrest Drive down Caneo School Road underneath the 101 freeway and then out to Hampshire, that has currently gone to construction, same with Rancho Road. And then the Los Feliz Drive sidewalk project is currently in design. But all total, we've received about $5 million in grant funding to, and that's part of my job, is to keep trying to get more funding so we can keep adding more projects to our construction list. Okay, next slide. Helen, next slide. Okay, an important part of the active transportation plan, it's not just about building bike lanes and sidewalks. It also has a whole section on developing networks that embrace new mobility options like scooters, e-bikes. It includes ideas of where to put bike fix-it stations, bike scooter parking, and charging stations. Okay, next slide. And I will hand it off to Walker. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
All right, thank you, Kathy. And yeah, good evening, everyone. Walker Wells with Ramey Associates again. Thanks to Sammy, Helen, and Kathy for the kind of the setup, the background conditions on policy, what's driving the sort of city's actions from a state policy level, and then the sort of background on the inventory, where our vehicle emissions are coming from, and then all of the work that's happening on active transportation. So we just want to take a moment here and open it up. There's the next section gets into, what can we do? What are the options for lower carbon mobility? But we just wanted to open it up here to see if there's any questions or comments just about sort of the background conditions on policy or what the city is currently doing.
Maybe before we jump into that, the chat window has been pretty active, which is great. I encourage everyone to use that. But there were a couple people that got confused perhaps on the transportation question and thought that we actually meant using buses in a different city. So maybe you were in LA and used the LA bus versus starting or ending in Thousand Oaks and going to another destination, which may have driven the numbers higher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what we were wondering is if people have used any of the commuter buses. So there's, the TO Transit, but then there are other buses that come into the transit center. So that was, I think, more what we were wondering is if people are using the services, it will take you to, Ventura or into LA or other places.
Walker, it looks like we have a question from Joni Burns.
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a great presentation, Kathy. My question is, with the propensity for cycling in particular, do you have anything to say how many of those are recreational cyclists versus commuters? Because I think, like my observation when we're talking about cycling accessibility is there's two groups. There's cyclists, and then there's people who want to ride bikes, and they're very different people. There's a lot of people who really want to use their bikes, but they're afraid. And the cyclists are not gonna, a lot of times, ride on a commuter bike path. It's dangerous, actually. So is there any granularity to that data?
I think by using so many different layers in the GIS, it was looking at people's income and car ownership and trying to figure out where, and density of housing, how many people live in each household. And then overlaying it with where the business are, really the attractors. So if you look like where do people live that might be commuting to these, it didn't really look at jobs. It didn't say, okay, somebody lives in Westlake and wants to ride their bike to Rancho Conejo. It was more looking if you want to ride your bike to parks and shopping and downtown, like Civic Arts Plaza. Those were some of the attractors. And then the generators were where they lived and the type of housing they lived in.
Okay, so it was a propensity, but it didn't have any actual, just because like I know those routes along Hillcrest in particular, and I saw how it was really kind of moving out towards Agora, and that's a really popular route to get out to the mountains for like a cyclist who's going to go for a 60-mile bike ride. but there was also, those are also, like you say, high levels of housing and businesses. So that's what I was trying to get my head around is what.
Right, it was less about recreational cyclists, although we had surveys that were done, and our surveys, just like earlier with this group, maybe we translate, our surveys are very biased towards recreational serious cyclists, because those are the people that are the most vocal about cycling. It's not the gentleman that might be riding his bike down Tier Boulevard to work at the auto mall. He's not filling out my surveys. So we understand that our surveys are biased, so we make sure we include that, understanding that it's a bias in the survey.
Okay, super helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. Andrew, you have your hand up?
Yes, good evening. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I apologize, I can't turn on my camera. I'm actually ironically in my car traveling home from work. So count me in as a long mile traveler. Thank you, staff, for the presentation. I wanted to follow up, Kathy, on the last slide regarding e-bikes and scooters and kind of some other alternative forms of transportation. Can you just get in a little bit more detail as to what's in the plan? I don't really recall. I wanted to find out, what did council vote on and what did council kind of consider in the plan in 2019?
Okay, so regarding, we'll talk about like e-bikes and e-scooters, more e-scooters to what the city right now is. I almost want to say we're in a reactionary mode. Any business that wants to come and pitch to the city and consider having a business with e-bikes or e-scooters, the council is open to listen to. They went into an agreement with Bird Scooters. It was horrible timing because it was the same night as they talked about the Woodsley fire. It was like literally the week after the fire when council was dealing with that. And then Bird never followed through. So that's just, Bird is just kind of sitting out there. But I think all scooters businesses have learned a lot in the last 2 years. We have a mobility committee that has businesses on it, has chamber, has large employers, that we're ready to meet anytime somebody wants to come in. So we've had different bikes companies come in and meet with the city, but they haven't followed through. But for example, we had OFO gave the city a couple bikes for staff to try out, and then the entire business went bankrupt and left the country. So that's kind of where we are right now. We're open to the city, to respond to what the consumer market wants to bring to the city.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, others with questions? While you're debating, if you have a comment, I can do a quick summary of a few things I've seen in the chat. So not surprisingly, a lot of the concerns about cycling are related to safety. And, safety will be, Kathy's nodding her head, but, about creating these sort of continuous, protected or safe bike routes. So, as somebody who has cycled off and on for various reasons, recreation or getting to work, it's a drag when there's a wonderful bike lane and then it just drops off somewhere and tosses you to the wolves. So, so we've seen this about safety, and maybe I'll do this all at once, Kathy. And then, that was the main one on bikes, actually. And then on the buses, there was a lot of discussion about smaller buses and, of course, more frequent schedules. But just a question if you need a whole bus, Mike, given the ridership, or if there's other more flexible ways to handle it.
Yes, certainly there's multimodal models for us to look at. We're constrained partially by our funding type and how we have to use it. Particularly for a small agency like ours, we can't invest in a lot of different types of things. The cost to maintain these and how we fund them makes that very difficult. And one of the important things to keep in mind is, while on average you may only see 6 to 8 people on a bus, there are times, particularly during non-COVID times, where we can have 40 people or 50 people on a bus. And we have to design for that. And it's important to keep in mind that whether that bus is transporting 1 person or 40 people, that cost to the city is the same. If you were to take a single bus and supplant that with, say, 3 or 4 different vans, you've now multiplied the cost by a factor of 4, plus you're now also increasing your vehicle miles traveled. you're increasing your emissions. So there is a balance between those two. As an agency, if you were here 10 years ago, all the buses were 40-foot buses. Now, most of the buses are 30 or 35, and the electric buses that we have just contracted to purchase are about 27 foot. So we do recognize that the size and capacity is an issue, but we do need to make sure that for those instances that we do need it, that we have a vehicle that can support the needs, particularly of the school-age children who are dependent upon that service.
Okay, thanks. And then Cindy and Lynn, I'll get you in just a second. But Kathy, is in the sort of the active transportation plan, you know, is like safety criteria 1 or connectivity number 2, or is there some sort of blend in how the projects are identified?
The projects are identified and presented to the city council as data driven. So it's as the facilities are, again, the propensity where people would use them and where it's the most uncomfortable to use a facility. So that those ranked higher, they ended up coming up higher. That being said, it doesn't mean that the list is a priority list that the council will immediately build, because all projects need to be funded. And depending on what grant is available, there may be project number 4 that's closer to a school that there's funding through Safe Routes to School that we would apply for that project, because it actually would meet the ability to get closer to a school, where maybe in another place there isn't. So yeah, it's prioritized based on safety's in there, but there's many factors that's in there.
Okay, great. Okay, Linda. On mute. There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, so a lot, you know, I sell e-bikes, and one of the great things about e-bikes lets you get up the hills, which is a really big barrier to people being able to cycle in the area. But beyond that, the next thing I hear from, you know, at least half of the people that come in our store is it's not safe. It's don't feel safe to ride. They buy their bikes to drive them to Ojai, to ride the Ojai Ventura Trail, or to Will Rogers Beach, where they can ride for 30 miles on a beach bike path. And those are obviously recreational cyclists, but these are people that would also use their bikes to run to the store or go to their doctor appointment or whatever, if they didn't feel like they were going to die every time they got on their bicycle. And one of the issues, I've been on the bicycle advisory team for Thousand Oaks for several years now, is that anytime we ask people to even consider giving up part of the street for bikes, it becomes just a brouhaha of vitriol and horror. And I just wondering what people think we can do to help change people's attitudes about what we should promote, which right now we promote single car trips. We give people free parking wherever they go. We give them lots of lanes of traffic, even when many times in the city you can drive anywhere you want and have no traffic at all. But we have to plan for peak hours, which is, we have these giant roads that have 4 lanes across that, are designed to move traffic during an hour in the morning and an hour at night. So anyway, I just think there has to be some effort given to changing people's mindsets if we're going to get the residents of the city on board with giving up some of their perks as they see it, in order to make the city more livable and more transitable. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there's definitely a discussion about, all that public right of way belongs to the public, and then, having a more comprehensive discussion about how it's allocated across all of the different users. And so much of us have just grown up with this idea that streets are for cars drive on them, they park on them, and then other things are intrusions into that, but it is the public's right of way. And we could talk about how it's allocated. Okay, Cindy, you are up.
So I I'm parenting at the same time that I'm listening to this, so I admit I probably listened with half of my brain, which is cut by half again because of COVID. But anyway, I think I heard a mobility committee that there is one that the city has. Was that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thumbs up. Okay,
Yes.
and I'm just, Kathy, I'm just wondering on that mobility committee, is there one from the disability or aging community that's represented? Because when I think about mobility and planning and sidewalks, the accessibility for wheelchair users, so we have a lot of beautiful hills here. But you know, there are some sidewalks where there's a great power pole planted in the middle of the sidewalk. So a wheelchair user needs to then descend the sidewalk somehow. So I'm just wondering, is there a disability or aging representative on those committees, and how do we get those voices or experiences shared as part of the planning process?
So I misspoke. Our mobility committee, it's an alternative mobility committee. It's for e-bikes and e-scooters. It was formed a couple of years ago to address that request. There's an accessible access. I'm flaking on what the term is, committee. I hate to call it just committee. And actually, somebody on the city may know the official name for it. And I know they meet on an as-needed basis. As big projects even come in, the accessible access committee looks at large projects, make sure that there's access on that. And that's how the city reaches out. And it's a committee. I can find out more information about that and get that back to you if you'd like.
That's the
That would
Disabled
be great.
Access and Appeals Advisory Board.
Thank you.
And I looked into that advisory board. I think it's been a while since they've met, and I think most of it is about exclusions or what is it, anomalies or allowances for to I'm sorry, I can't think of the word, but it's not part of the planning process to include people with disabilities or wheelchairs users. I think that committee comes together to talk about those who have applied for some sort of grant or allowance or exclusion from some rule. I think the last time that committee met has been over a year. So I've asked the city council to put an ad hoc committee, and the mayor specifically put an ad hoc committee together for disability inclusion in some of the general plan. So when it comes to mobility and sidewalk design, that sort of perked my ears.
I know that the city has been, has a state ADA requirements that, all the sidewalks are built to, and has been putting in those, the bobble, ramps at all the intersections. So every time there's a street project, those new ADA, requirements are met, and streets are made more, and sidewalks are made more accessible. So that's something that's happening over time.
I can appreciate that. And unfortunately, when we revert to laws that come about because things weren't done, it's not necessarily innovation or forward-thinking progress. So I think all of us planning and thinking and imagining what the next 25 years of TO could be, that's the opportunity for innovation, rather than to rely on the minimum requirements of ADA, which even, I've read some editorials, they balked at the expense of accessibility. So appreciate the time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Arash.
Hi, good evening, thanks. Whenever Kathy was discussing the new pedestrian ways and bikeways that are being built, you mentioned the high cost of these for the low mileage that you get out of them. Could you give some more background as to why those costs are so high, or maybe what, if they're not that high, how they compare in proportion to how much we spend on supporting automobiles? And I had no context for those numbers, so I don't know what what they mean.
Right. And what I don't have is, and I saw a question in the chat about that, for new roads. For a big thing, the city doesn't build any new roads. For the most part, the roads that you see out there, any new roads that have been built in the last 20 years were built by developers to extend or connect, make connections. That being said, the city maintains roads, and I might apologize, I don't have the maintenance numbers. The reason bicycle and pedestrian projects are so expensive is that almost always the sidewalk is going, even though it's in this, I can say we never take right of way. So we're building it within the existing right of way, but usually that right of way already has driveway along the street. So as you go down and build a sidewalk, you have to redesign the person's entire driveway so the driveway maintains the correct slope. So unless the street's flat, and as Linda said, nothing's flat in the city that's out there, it seems. So just a very simple street like Los Feliz has enough grade change that we're rebuilding everyone's driveways as part of building a 5-foot sidewalk. Like, and that's a big, and you know, there's the costs to relocate utilities. Most of the stuff that, as we say, everything easy has been done. There's usually utilities in the way. So we're trying to get around power poles because we can't afford to take the power poles down. That's not even it. Those costs I showed you don't include removing power poles. So it's the cost of utilities and going, you know, rebuilding people's driveways to put sidewalks in is part of the big cost.
So if I may just have one follow-up question then. So if we were to change our priorities as a city and decide, you know what, we want to take one of these 6 lanes on Westlake Boulevard and dedicate it to a bike instead, that would probably drastically reduce the amount of money required to add pedestrian and bike pathways on any given street then, yes? If we didn't have to like push into people's driveways and existing sidewalks and things of that sort. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, but as Linda said, it's such a hard battle because like we tried to take away a lane on Arbalest between Herbs Road and Westlake Boulevard when the street was being repaved and make a very wide bike lane with a buffer. And again, it's 3 lanes in each direction. And after a very, very contentious meeting with more than 100 residents, it didn't happen. And now you still have a lot of pavement out there that could have been used for a safer bicycling experience. But yes,
So,
you're
okay.
you're absolutely right.
So it's up to us to convince our fellow residents that this is the right thing to do, and for us to come out and show our support whenever these things come up in front of the council. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is often an issue with cyclists, is you need a constituency to advocate for cycling, but if it's not safe to cycle, you don't build that constituency. It's a little bit of a chicken or the egg. You know, strategy that's been used in a lot of other places, and you may have tried this too, Kathy, is, you know, to do these sort of short-term tactical modifications of a street and say, we're just going to try it out, you know, for a weekend or a week and give people a chance to, you know, experience it and realize that, you know, traffic doesn't grind to a halt and so on and so forth. So, you know, this can be done with the orange cones, and there's more sophisticated ways to do it without having to get into the sort of more costly construction that would be related to making it permanent. So that might be something that could be considered. They call this, you know, tactical urbanism or tactical mobility. So, okay, let's see who is next. Veronica is next, I believe. Veronica, do you still have your hand up? I mean, you do, but do you still want to jump in? All right. I'm gonna go to Rosa. Oh, there you are. Okay.
So sorry about that. We are okay, thank you.
Oh, all right. Okay, on to Roseanne. And then let's do this. We'll go back to Joan, hear from Richard, and then we'll stop this part of the discussion and go into this next section, which really is about like, what are the kind of things that we could do. So, okay.
I actually just wanted to agree with your tactical change idea. I know that when COVID was initiated, or when COVID started, that there were a lot of streets that got closed off to traffic in Europe, and they've since become permanently closed off because people realized, given the opportunity, that they really liked reclaiming their streets. So maybe we could try, you know, rotating your idea of tactical strategical closures throughout the city, just to give people a taste of what's the advantages of doing so.
Okay. And a little closer to home, you know, State Street is closed off in Santa Barbara, finally, after talking about it for 40 or 50 years. And then there's any number of slow streets where there'll just be a little like sawhorse put up, you know, designated as a slow street all through Culver City and Los Angeles. Just things, you know, I've seen. And the part of this is to use the public right of way, you know, to give people a chance to be outside and recreate. And so, you know, this is a little bit of sort of rethinking about all of that asphalt and what you can do with it. Okay. Okay. R.O. Miller, I'm going to put you in line here, though. I see you. Okay. All right, Joan, back to you, and then we'll have Richard, and then we'll have R.L. And then we'll move on with the slides.
Thank you. Just, you know, that we heard the comment about people are afraid they're going to die when they get on a bike. And, you know, any opportunity, I think, to just completely take the bikes and the cars and separate them, I think is ideal. I know it's not realistic in a lot of ways. I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. They had a lot of old railroads that they could convert to bike paths. You know, that's not available to us, but there are horse paths. And then the other thing my husband and I have been talking about is, what about all along the arroyos? There's the paths. And I know I was working down in Huntington Beach, and there's paths all along the rivers, the arroyos, that you can use. Could that not be opened up somehow? You could enter into an agreement and maybe work with CASA for COSCA to maintain those. Has that been looked at all?
So yes, we've looked at it, and we just don't have what like CME has, is a very long contiguous exposed channel. When you're walking around the city dry, you might see an exposed channel, but then look on the other side of the street, it actually then becomes underground. So yes, we continue to look at it. I was just going to have our GIS coordinator actually make a map so people could see what I'm talking about. Like, so if you see on a map, these are all the exposed channels, but that they don't really connect. We're doing a little one. We're going to actually, it's just in the budget. We don't know if we can do it between Reno Road and Knollwood, so kids can not have to walk on Lynn Road. But unfortunately, the 8 property owners adjacent to it actually own the channel, and the flood control district has an easement over top of them. So we actually have to get permission from those 8 property owners to allow people to use their property, even though it looks like a channel. But we would love to do it if we just had more opportunity. But that's right now, we actually have a project in the budget that we're going to try to do, which will really help kids not having to walk down Reno and walk along Lynn to get to school, and the park that's right by Banyan.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay, thanks, Joan. Richard?
Hey, guys.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I've been designing transportation systems for a long time, and never like for my own town, usually for big corporations or cities. And it requires a lot of long-term vision. So I'm really happy there's a vision underway and it's long-term. My experience, though, has been that the next 15 or 20 years are not going to be nearly as stable as the last 20 or 50 years. And so there needs to be a long-term vision and I think goals, but I think we need to be really not sort of, how should we say? You shouldn't just be set and say, hey, there's a plan that we can all go back to sleep. Like, there needs to be a plan, but frankly, we need to do a lot of pilots. I think there needs to be a very open strategy to piloting new things, what you're calling, let's try this for a week, right? Let's try that for a week. And so I really think, a week is a guess, but obviously depends on what you're trying to pilot. And so I think really pilots of new things is going to be something we shouldn't ever stop doing. Just because we have a plan and we have a vision, that's great. That must do that. But I think things are changing so fast in the next 20 years that no plan or vision that we have now will probably actually survive that. And so I'm all about like, okay, let's do low risk tests, as many as we can, of things that we think are really important to us. And that's how we'll change our transportation system. I've done a lot of like visioneering projects and it's great, but I think the piloting and trial and error approach needs to come to the fore a little bit more. That's all I got to say. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hara?
Hey Hi folks, R.L. Miller here. What came to mind, especially as Richard was talking about trying various things for a week or so, is, and I've put this on in the chat, but I wanted to expand on it so that everybody can hear me, is the Ciclavia idea. I believe that in cities other than Los Angeles, it's pronounced Ciclavia. The idea is that you close a street for a weekend and let people ride their bikes and what have you, and you rotate it, you turn it into a bit of a festival, much like what we already do with the Rotary Moore Park street fair in October, where we close off that a couple of key portions of Moore Park Boulevard. Let's, once the pandemic lifts, what's wrong with simply trying Ciclavias in different parts of the city and see which ones seem to make the most sense, which ones seem to get the most popularity. Close off a street for a weekend, see if it actually gets people to come out of their cars and play in the streets, if you will. Walk, bike, use the streets, and maybe from that you can determine some trends that may inform a potential street closure in the following year.
Great.
So we've had one a couple of years ago, was on Halloween out in the Westlake area. It was a trial. You could say it was successful. The response I understand from our city council is they are absolutely open to it, but it has to be more organically driven. It's not something that staff is going to do. It would be something that the community wants, like have the community ask for it, and then we would start working on it. A very important component of it is all the cyclovias in LA are funded by grant funding that was for LA County, and not, I even went to a meeting trying to get the money and it wasn't available for any cities in Ventura County. So they have a 0.5 cent sales tax. They use their money for transportation. And I hate to be a cranky person about this, but it's about money and they cost a lot of money. And I can tell you the businesses adjacent to when you're going to close a street don't necessarily embrace it. So it's something, again, it has to be done organically where everyone wants it. And especially Al Adams was very much pro, and same with Claudia, about putting on the cyclovia a couple of years ago. They were on the council. So that's where it stands right now. We're open to it, but it needs to be done organically.
Okay, thanks. All right, Ben, let's hear from you and then we'll dive back into the slides.
Yeah, sure. Just a quick one on bicycling. I had a question for Kathy about if the city's looked at alternative routes for bicycling that aren't on the major streets. So I noticed that most of the routes are along the major roads. And I know that there's a lot of side streets which follow the same paths, and they may be a little bit more circuitous, but are a lot less traffic driven. And example I give is Michael Drive in Newbury Park, which goes past Sequoia. You'll notice a lot of people bicycle there. There's no bike lanes there, but it's a lot better than the actual marked bicycle lanes elsewhere because there's no traffic. So is there any thought to doing more of that?
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting because we just talked about that exact route with the bicycle advisory team to put more signage up so people know to use Michael, and when they get to the end, how they're are able to cut through at the community orchard park at the end. The balance is how many signs do people that you put up and understanding where people are coming and going. And we use an example a lot of times where, let's say you and another person in your family both said, well, how would you bike to get from A to B? And you both would have completely different routes, given that you both are very familiar with the city. So it's doing that balance between, yes, cutting through the neighborhoods is great. It's not what a commuter cyclist necessarily wants to do. It's definitely safer, but there's that balance. Like how many signs do you put up that tells people, well, you have to know where they're going, where they're coming and going. And then we're always looking at, can somebody just figure it out on phones? Would that be easier to do on an app where you say where you're coming and going, like a Google Maps, and then you click on not on major streets, and then it takes you that way, opposed to putting up 50 signs in a neighborhood telling people where they're going to turn every which way. So that's what we're thinking.
this app, by the way, works well. My 15-year-old uses it. He was like, look, they have the not on major streets option for him. So, because he rides his bike a lot, but you want to stay off the big streets. So, I think one thing that's come up, just to wrap up this little piece, is, there's a lot of different reasons people that ride their bikes. So, there's definitely the recreational, people who are, wanting to get in 50 or 60 miles on a Saturday. They might, if they weren't biking, they might be hiking or playing golf or doing something else. So we may not be eliminating a vehicle trip and vehicle miles traveled. We may just be sort of enabling, healthy lifestyles. Of course, if those people are riding on the weekends, they may be more inclined to be riding their bike to do things during the rest of the week. And really, surprisingly, a lot of what we're trying to capture is like the 2 to 3 mile trip, which is where most of the driving comes from. So the trip to the store, the trip to drop off kids at school, some other errand or another. And then we often think of this as trying to have sort of a fully protected, unbroken 20-mile stretch of bike lanes, which is more of like a weekend kind of activity. And then, of course, there may be all different ages. We've got kids, teenagers, older people, people in work clothes. And so it's a pretty diverse constituent group that we're trying to meet with all of this. I think what we do know is when there's a bike lane, like is what behind Kathy and right in the background, seems to be a much loved bike lane, like you will ride your bike down that because it's safe. It seems to get people where they want to go. And so that may be the high bar to aspire to, but I think once that's in place, it certainly works. Final comment on all of this. I spent some time living in Scandinavia, and they're crazy for cycling, but they've also been crazy for building bike infrastructure for the past 50 or 60 years. So it isn't just because they're Danes or Swedes that they ride their bikes everywhere. It's because they have safe, protected, dedicated bike lanes, and that's been an infrastructure investment that's taken years to build up. So I think what we can think of is how we can start to continue to add to the infrastructure in the city, with the goal of having this connected network and really giving people a choice on mobility. Okay, back to the slides.
Okay, thank you everyone for that very active discussion. We're going to talk about the different strategies for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, and really there's 2 different ways of doing this, and we can talk about reducing miles, or we can talk about alternative vehicles, clean vehicles. And so Walker's going to lead us into this discussion.
Yes, all right. So, at the last meeting, and I think through some of the general plan outreach as well, we heard that there should be a commitment to enhance transit. And we've heard from Mike about some of the constraints that are there. I think a lot of the enhancement that people have been looking for is just greater frequency. It's not that the routes are in the wrong place, it's just that the bus doesn't come as often as they would like it to. We've heard some things about adding multifamily housing at sort of medium to higher densities in the correct places. So this is recognizing that there's a relationship between land use and transportation, and it works both ways. You can put a whole bunch of high density housing somewhere. It doesn't mean that people are going to walk and take their bike or ride transit. There have to be destinations and things for them to get to. We need to look at this relationship between jobs and housing and the degree to which we can have those 2 things closer to each other so that there's less commuting. And then there's also an understanding that things will look different as we I guess learn to live with COVID. And there's a lot of uncertainty about the willingness to take public transportation, and concerns that there will be an uptick in the use of private vehicles just because people will want to stay safe. I think another outcome of COVID, though, is that we have been walking more sort of as an activity, but that may have sort of helped us also recognize that more things are in walking distance than we may have realized. So that's a behavior we'd like to continue. Go to the next slide. Okay, so on transportation, and again, reminding ourselves that we're in the context, of a climate and environmental action plan. from a climate standpoint, we're focused on the greenhouse gases. So, we can either reduce the vehicle miles traveled by driving less far, or not driving at all by walking, biking, or emitting fewer greenhouse gases as we move around by, sharing a ride, with someone else, using transit. So there's certainly greenhouse gases emitted by the bus, but it's less than if all those people were taking their private cars. So this is a way to, reduce total VMT to shift it to other modes of travel. And then we have this other side of the equation, which for me is still relatively new, which is the clean VMT. So when you get an electric bus and you fill it with 100% renewable energy, there's no emissions related to the bus. And if you have an electric car and you fill it with renewable energy, it's VMT, but it's clean. That's the climate story. Now, you would still have the VMT, which creates a number of other concerns that we've talked about, which is congestion and safety and the amount of space that's needed to accommodate the cars. But if we're just looking through a climate standpoint, we're really trying to either reduce it or clean it up. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm taking the clean part, and Sammy and I are going to share this section. So Sammy, remind me when we're going to switch.
I think this is me.
This is you, right? You were doing the clean part. Yes. All right.
Yeah. So I'll tackle this first part, which is the clean VMT. And there are, as Walker said, there are some co-benefits to it, but there are also some limitations. So it's really a combination of these two main strategies that will help us not only reduce GHGs, but make a more livable community in Thousand Oaks. So some of the co-benefits of clean VMT include the ability to take advantage of the carbon-free electricity that's provided by the Clean Power Alliance, which the city is a member of. So that not only reduces GHGs, but can improve air quality and public health by reducing tailpipe emissions from electric vehicles. And so an EV can also, work with different solar PV systems, or really act like a battery in some ways that can be charged and discharged at different times to really help even out energy costs. So that's another thing that it can do. And I think most importantly, though, cleaning up VMT through vehicle electrification is something that we can accomplish in a shorter time frame than, say, the land use changes needed to enable mode shift. So that's kind of one of the key strategies that we can really kick off this clean VMT to help us get to reduced VMT in the long run. So next. So this is a map of publicly accessible EV chargers within the city. And you can see on this map that they're mostly concentrated in the downtown area. And this map also includes chargers that the city installed, but also that have been installed in private parking lots, like at shopping centers or places of work, places like that, but are on private property. So the city has about 248 chargers right now in the city, all publicly accessible, both on private property and city-owned property. But according to the state's EV blueprint, the city will need about 800 publicly accessible chargers to support an anticipated 18,000 EVs by the year 2030. And we're all I saw this come up in the chat, wondering how the executive order to buy zero emission vehicles will accelerate that adoption of EVs. And we're still all waiting to see how that plays out. But one way that the city can be ready is by installing these chargers and having the infrastructure available for people as they begin to transition to EVs. Next. So how does the city really get there? And there are a couple different ways. The city is really a facilitator of EV adoption. They can't, yank your car out of your garage and replace it with an EV. That's still up to individuals, what they choose to buy. So adopting an EV reach code for new construction is one of the tools that the city has to kind of not incentivize, but to require the installation of EV infrastructure in new construction. So these are two model codes. One was adopted by West Hollywood. The other is the model code language from Silicon Valley Clean Energy and Peninsula Clean Energy. And they're a little bit different, but you can see that they require a percentage of parking spaces to be able to support EV chargers either they're wired and ready at the time of occupancy of the building, or some of them are requiring that chargers be installed at time of occupancy. And it depends on the type of building. You can see that multifamily is treated differently than commercial, which is also treated differently than office buildings, because the needs are different and the times that vehicles will be there to charge are also different, as are the number of people there. So you can see that it changes based on type of building, size of building, and then what level of charging you can offer at that facility. So they're one way that the city can incentivize new construction or require new construction to prepare for the future adoption of EVs in the city. Next. And so how do we get this infrastructure to be included in existing buildings? And so as we learned from our chat, our conversation last month about existing buildings, they can be one of the hardest levers to pull when we're asking for or looking for GHG reductions. So in terms of upgrading existing buildings to include EV charging infrastructure, there are a couple of tools that the city has. The first is they can offer streamlined permitting, and that, this is an example of a very small example of a permit application for an EV charger. Generally, it's a pretty standard process for level 2 EV charger installations, and the city can standardize the application, put it online, make it easy to fill out, and then make it an over-the-counter approval at the planning counter. So those are ways that you can make it quicker and easier for people to install chargers at their properties. Second, the city can bring awareness to some of the incentives out there. The SCE Charge Ready program is financial incentives for properties who would like to install chargers, and there will be more funding in that program available this year. So if you're interested, or a property manager or property owner, there will be more funding available for that program in the coming year. Additionally, the city can raise awareness about the Ventura County program that there is a Regional Energy Alliance EV coach and advocate. One of the things that can really be a barrier to installing this EV infrastructure is that buildings are complicated. There's lots of questions about, electric infrastructure changes that might need to be made, who will pay for the electricity, where to site some of these chargers. So especially in existing buildings where you can't start from scratch in constructing a parking garage or parking lot, sometimes it's really helpful to have some there to help you, give you that technical assistance and help you kind of work out the details and complexities of these projects. And thirdly, the city could also take a more regulatory approach and require that, at a certain trigger point in a renovation, major renovation or property upgrade, something like that, that the panel capacity is upgraded in order to facilitate future EV installations. So that is another tool that they have in their belt. And finally, one of the more important things and another barrier is that existing properties have parking requirements that they have to meet. And then losing a space to an EV charger might make them worried that they would no longer be in compliance with their parking requirements. So the city could adopt different code language that ensures, gives assurance to property owners that when they transition a regular parking spot into an EV parking space, they're still in compliance with their parking requirements. So go ahead next.
All right, thanks, Sammy. Another quick poll, maybe while we
so
put
a
this
few
up.
questions about EV ownership and how you feel about EVs. So John just launched that poll, so appreciate your input here.
I saw this question by Kat about Cal Green and the REACH codes. So, REACH codes are codes that reach beyond the state minimum. So Cal Green does have requirements related to sort of electric vehicle charger readiness. So it asks that people put some infrastructure in their buildings, but it doesn't require that the chargers are actually installed. So where cities will adopt these REACH codes is they'll ask for for chargers to actually be installed or for the wire to actually be put into the conduit. So it isn't just that the infrastructure is there, but that the chargers are there. So this is something that could be looked at in Thousand Oaks from a REACH code standpoint, is again asking or requiring the actual installation.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, sure.
About halfway there.
Feels like there's a pent up market out there. A lot of people are doing research.
Oh, and one other thing that I could mention is that in terms of city operations, there are California Air Resources Board has a bunch of rules about when cities need to, into deadlines about when cities need to transition their fleet to ZEV. So not only buses, but also city fleet vehicles. So I've seen that come up in the chat, but there are already deadlines and rules about that. I think buses are, let me see, buses are by 2040, I want to say, with new purchases starting before then, and city fleet vehicles in total, I think are around the same deadline. And then I don't know, Mike, if you know more than that.
Yeah, I was going to say the city's expectation is that our bus fleet should be fully electrified by 2030, which is the starting point at which we're required to buy only zero emission vehicles. Dial-a-ride program probably won't hit that target, but it'll be on its way, and we're certainly already working to get the infrastructure ready and put in place to make that happen.
We've already started replacing older fleet vehicles as they come up for replacement, been buying electric fleet vehicles wherever that's feasible. So it's already kind of a strategy that the city's undertaking. Okay, so John's sharing the results here. We have a pretty sizable EV population within our group, certainly more than what's represented more broadly across the city, not surprisingly, I guess, given the interest of the group here. Lots of people looking at them. Interesting that, yes, cost is a significant factor. Even though costs have come down, certainly you can still get a traditional gasoline car for considerably cheaper than an EV. But good to see that research. Yes, and you know, with some of the incentive programs with EVs, that's being extended, I believe, at the federal level. And there's a fair number of incentives still out there.
Point out that on question 2, we didn't allow for, I already own an EV, so kind of overlooked that one. So they had to answer it even if they had already owned one.
Oh.
I thought it says if you don't own or lease an EV.
But they still had to answer it. So we didn't have a, yeah.
No, okay.
I got it.
Okay, I think we're done with this poll.
Yeah, well, this definitely, I mean, it's interesting. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty, speculation about the rate of adoption of EVs. When you look at this poll, you'd see there's, you know, a lot of people interested in doing research and, you know, very likely considering it. So, you know, if we're going to go from 3% to nearly everything in the next, whatever it is, 25 years, then you know, people are going to have to feel comfortable doing it. And it looks like cost is the main barrier. So if the cost comes down and the charging's there, it actually feels like this transition could happen.
Yeah, and the cost is also partially a result of EVs are a little pricier up front, but long term, because of the maintenance, and many folks may still not be aware of, but it costs half of that, what it costs to maintain a regular vehicle. So those may not be factored in. So that's more of an educational opportunity for us, I would say.
Yes.
And I just dropped a link into the chat with some of the state incentives and more information about federal incentives as well for EV purchasing. Also wanted to note that used EVs are becoming much more affordable. So that's another option people have rather than buying a new car, kind of as we move into the second gen EV world.
Yeah, and there's also sometimes some pretty incredible leases. There's a lease up in the Bay Area right now for like $49 for a new EV. So
yeah, a lot of people are choosing to go with leases just because the technology is changing so quickly. that, you know, you don't know whether your technology is going to be current 4 years from now with an EV compared to, you know, a traditional vehicle. So leases actually have been really good value. So it's something to look at for sure. Even people who traditionally would just buy a car, lease can actually be a cheaper option. Okay, so we will move on to looking at the other side of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, which is reducing the actual vehicle miles traveled. Yep. So Walker.
Okay, so you know, we talked about a number of the ways to reduce vehicle miles traveled. You see it here: walking, biking, taking transit, teleworking, not going anywhere at all. And it's also helpful to just acknowledge the co-benefits. Yeah, you know, you get improved air quality because there are other tailpipe emissions that happen when you're combusting fossil fuels. There's carbon monoxide and particulate matter, which can have a connection to public health. Getting people out of the car can reduce traffic congestion, safer conditions for people who want to be biking. And then there's a health benefit too from, you know, walking, biking. And, you know, when you take transit, you also often end up walking or biking. And there's can also just be, of course, more of a feeling of connection to the community and to your neighborhood that happens from, you know, not being in your private vehicle. Next slide. So some of this is certainly driven by land use. And, you know, we've talked about the provision of safe, like sidewalks in the first place. It says safety, safe bike lanes, frequent transit. But, you know, the land use is a factor. And shifting land use is really a generational undertaking. It's, you know, a 25-year process, which is why it's completely correct that it's, you know, one of the main things that's being explored in the general plan update is sort of an investigation of land use alternatives, you know, for the future growth of the city. These 5 Ds that are listed here will be the factors that influence people's willingness to not use the car, basically. So you do need a certain amount of density of development to provide the types of things that people like to walk to: stores, shops. You need a certain amount of density of people to support a public transit system. You need a diversity of uses. So just a monoculture of housing or a monoculture of, you know, retail doesn't necessarily promote walking and biking. Things need to be designed to be pleasant. You have to feel like the sidewalk's wide enough to be safe. It's shaded, there's signage, there's lighting, there's interesting things to look at. You need to be able to access a destination. So, you know, you're only going to walk or bike or take the bus somewhere if there's somewhere to go to. So, you know, you need a destination. And then this question of how far is it to the bus stop or, you know, or the train? Like, are you willing to walk 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you know, 15 minutes? So this is when you bring these different things together, you can start to see a movement in behavior in, you know, like the 10 to 15% range. So it's not going to negate all use of the car, but these things in combination can actually have a demonstrable and actually sort of like, you know, verified correlation to reduced vehicle use. Okay, on to the next slide. And some of these things are being considered with the land use options for the general plan, which, you know, there's 3 options, and a lot of them look at the sort of different land uses along this corridor that you see here with the purple shading, and, you know, sort of various combinations of jobs and housing and densities of development, but most of it is focused around those areas. And some of the strategies are to implement the active transportation plan that Kathy talked about, to follow the complete streets policy that really says a street should not be dedicated to or dominated by any singular mode of transportation, which, you know, is typically the car, but a complete street accommodates all the modes of transportation. And it also accommodates, you know, young people, old people, people with varying types of mobility or accessibility. Then you have a street that's complete in its function. Improving and or maintaining amenities for transit riders. So, you know, you need shade, a light, a map, a place to sit down. It needs to be clean. It needs to feel safe. You know, this is the least we can do for people who are choosing to take the bus. And then simple things like saying, you know, there's no vehicle idling at schools, which is, you know, wasting fuel, emitting greenhouse gases, probably creating a little carbon monoxide hotspot, not good for the health of the people in the cars or for the kids. And so we can go to the next slide. And several people in the chat and earlier just mentioned these different sort of emerging sort of e-mobility options that are out there, which include the dockless bike share, electric or not, but these are just the bikes that don't go into a designated parking spot or docking station that you can leave anywhere, and you can find them with an app on your phone. Similarly with the scooters, so there's Bird and Lime and a number of other ones that sort of descended upon all of us, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. They're great. They provide this kind of connectivity for the last mile, half a mile from the train station, the bus stop. They're terrible because they end up all over the place. They block the sidewalk. It's total chaos, which is why this drawing down here is an example of how people are thinking about these things, that you need to dedicate spaces for parking the scooters and the bikes. We also need to acknowledge that people do take Uber and Lyft, and that there are delivery vehicles that are coming in and out of places, all of which need space along the curb. So in the world of transportation planning, this curb management discipline has really come forward to say, how do we not just think about how we use the street, but how are we dedicating the use of the curb to fit in all of these new uses that weren't necessarily anticipated before. Which also gets back to the fact that the public right-of-way is from the edge of the building, includes the sidewalk, includes the curb, the street, the curb on the other side, the sidewalk up to the edge of the building. And so all of that, we have the potential to rethink, again, the distribution of it, across these different modes of transportation and different needs. Next slide. Okay, so at this point, we're pretty much right on schedule. Sammy's gonna walk us through some of the findings from this mobility ideas mapping exercise that we've done. So the designated stakeholders were all given a link to a map, and then starting tonight, we're going to open it up for everyone else of the city, where people can kind of drop in sort of a pin. Sammy will probably describe this better than I can, but also with a note about the type of thing they would like to see in that physical location. So we're trying to move beyond ideas of complete streets and different types of mobility and really try to get to what might this mean in Thousand Oaks. And Kathy's probably aware of a number of these things, but we may unearth some hidden jewels of opportunity that can be explored going forward. So hand it over to you, Sam.
Great. So can everyone see the screen here with the mapping exercise? Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, like Walker said, we had our stakeholder group kind of fill out this map, or several maps actually, to kind of share mobility ideas and GHG reduction ideas related to biking, pedestrian facilities, transit, and EVs on a platform called Conveo. So this is Conveo, and it's actually really fun to use, really interactive with each other, and then also with the city as well. So I'm just going to go through a couple of our maps and pull out some of the common themes that we've heard so far. And then like Walker said, we're going to open it up to the public so they have a chance to also comment and agree, disagree with what's already been said. So we'll start with Bikeways, since that's kind of our first map here. And another note, these maps are all from the active transportation plan. So if you want more detail, you can also go back to that plan and see where they came from. Okay. So some of the common themes that we heard about biking and active transportation facilities were her general support for e-bikes and scooters, bike share stations throughout the city. And then what's really cool about this is it allows you to put them where you would like. So for example, we have comments around here, and this one's actually about bike paths and safety and looking for protected bike lanes, which was another common theme that we heard. So you can pinpoint where on the map you'd like it, and then you can not only leave a comment, but you can reply to people's comments, agree, disagree with these little voting arrows, and things like that. So it's really fun. So some of the other comments that we heard about bikes and active transportation are a lot of what's been echoed already in the chat. A lot of safety concerns, and some of them are highlighted here. We look at opportunity for alternative bike paths and alternative biking routes throughout the city. and on less, lower volume streets and with lower speeds. So it's a really cool way to interact with the maps. So those are some of the common themes we've heard. Again, we talked about a bunch of them already in kind of our first set of questions. So moving on to pedestrian facilities. Let me just zoom out a little bit for everyone. So again, it's the same base map, but instead is highlighting, pedestrian facilities within the city. So again, there were, a lot of really great comments that we got from people related to pedestrian facilities. And a lot of them were mostly focused on safety and connectivity improvements. So for example, they're talking about adding sidewalks along Westlake, adding more pedestrian crossings along Wendy, and also providing better access to and more parking at trailheads. So we've gotten some of those in order to kind of streamline that process as well, since T Oaks is, so one of the reasons that people live there is access to nature. So we need to be able to provide those connections for people walking in the city so they don't necessarily have to drive. And another thing that was really interesting about this one is we heard that there's interest in preserving and planting new shade trees along sidewalks and other pedestrian paths. So that's a way to encourage using those paths even when it's hot in the summer, and just providing some shelter along those. So moving on to transit, we asked people to give general comments about transit and highlight, specific areas where they think connections would be good or better service or more frequency would be helpful. Most of the comments were around expanding service, both routes and frequency, like we've talked about. And then there was another idea of really pairing, so you can see some of these, a fun trolley system, but the idea of pairing our e-mobility options or bike share or e-bikes with transit stops so that we can kind of start to solve that first last mile issue throughout the city and make it a full service kind of door-to-door option for people to use. So again, these are some of the comments we've had related to transit. And then finally, we have a map of EV chargers within the city. And related to EVs, the common comments really included installing EVs at workplaces, or EV chargers, excuse me, at workplaces, and maybe requiring that as part of the TDM program or menu of options. And then that the city should install additional chargers at places where people tend to park for extended periods of time. So parks, sports fields, the library and teen center. And then we had another comment about using, utilizing the curb as a place to charge EVs as well. So maybe on main arterials that are in the downtown area that facilitate on-street parking. So those are kind of the high level common themes that we've seen kind of throughout these maps. So again, we'll open this up to everyone, and I think Walker was going to facilitate some discussion. I see the chat blowing up, so I think we can bring it back and wrap it up with discussions, and we can keep these maps up if that's helpful, or we can bring it back to so everyone can see everyone's face up to Walker. You're muted. Walker, you're muted.
Thanks, Sammy. I was just saying, I think it'd be nice to just stop doing the sharing. I mean, that was great, and we encourage everyone to use the maps. The designated stakeholders have a link, and then there will be a link on the city's website about the climate action plan. So anybody's able to go in and put in their 2 cents worth. So we've got 23 minutes. So let's and thanks. The chat has lots of great stuff, and it's easy to go back and look at it. So appreciate everybody for what's being contributed. And then we'll just take comments. So Rosanna, I think you're first in line.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's good, and for giving us an opportunity to talk further about this. So I'm very fortunate that I grew up in a city where mass transit was just part of the, you know, the fabric of the city. I grew up in San Francisco, so I never had to worry about a car or how to get anywhere. I just walked down the block and the bus was there. So moving to Southern California, where there's really no mass transit, is really, it's so sad. So I can't see you reducing, you know, car pollution unless you really invest in mass transit, which means you have to have more buses, you know, a frequent expansion of what the, you know, what the bus route looks like, and not have to wait for an entire hour in between bus, you know, in between the route. It's just not, it's almost like not having a bus. So that's one point. My other one is that I don't know if you've thought about the impact of Uber and Lyft in, you know, in this whole process, just because it has had an impact in San Francisco, where they are using less mass transit and more Uber and Lyft. And then my other point is that, have you thought about reaching out to AYSO and all of the other, you know, school activities after school? Because, you know, as a parent, my son's in college now, but before that, from from middle school to high school, even elementary school, that's why parents are lined up with their cars idling, because as soon as they pick up their kids, they have to drop them off at AYSO soccer or ballet or something. So there has to be something else thought about with some of these outside activities. So that's kind of what my thinking is. So, but thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I think I lost track of everyone. I think it's Kyle and then Roseanne and then Catherine. So we'll go like that. Okay, Kyle.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
keep in mind I'm working with 20 minutes here, so.
I'll try to keep it concise. Thank you, city staff and everyone for this discussion. Looking at those maps and looking at them kind of simultaneously with the land use maps, my thought is that I think that focusing a lot on improved transit and people's safety concerns with transit to the village centers, or what I think they're calling the village centers, is something that really we should focus on. I know that a lot of the land use maps are really focused on developing Teal Boulevard, which is dope for the next 30 or 40 years. But in the meantime, the land use maps make it very clear that nothing's going to change outside of that corridor, which means that we should really be serving a lot of the people, myself included, not in the Teal corridor. I know, especially since the pandemic, most of the few places I've been going has been my little local hub. And I know that getting to my local hub requires me riding a bike across 2 freeway on-ramps. So there and back it's 4, which, you know, I consider I'm relatively safe when I do it, but I can only imagine what it's like for someone who's not that comfortable. And then my only other thought is I also feel like a lot of our apartment complexes, where maybe not everyone owns a car and can't purchase an EV car in the next 10 years. You know, they're going to be best served if we're focusing on those village centers. So that's my thought. And thank you again.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you, Kyle. Okay, Roseanne. You're up.
Hi, I would like to reiterate what Kyle said. I took a trip to Asia a couple of decades ago, and one of the most impressive places I was visiting for mobility was South Korea, where basically they interface all of their transportation modalities. So you would go to the same transportation station for the train, for the bus, for car rentals, everything was at a centralized station. And I think that with our village centers, we can do the same thing by locating our bike share racks there and making them transit stops, which they already are. All of those things should be interfacing at the village squares. I also wanted to talk about the school situation and reiterate what I saw in the notes about the idling problem with parents waiting in line, both at pickup and drop off at our schools. I don't know what the solution to that is, but we could eliminate, I think, a significant amount of emissions. if we dealt with those. And also, maybe we want to reinstate school buses, and they should be electric. And I think that's all the time I want to take, so other people have time to talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, Catherine.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the education or like school aspect, because most students live pretty far from school, from high schools at least. So for example, like if someone lived in Dos Vientos and wanted to go to Newbury Park High School, they would have to walk like 20-30 minutes, which is a significant amount of time. And then also it's kind of unsafe. A lot of like parents are concerned for their students and kids if they do walk to school, because there have been like some incidents of like cars just pulling up and next to like students walking back home from school. So all of this has just caused some like hesitation, and like parents have to reconsider how they want their kids to go to school.
Yeah, okay. Yes, these are tricky things, particularly the safety aspect. I think a lot of us are dropping off and picking up our kids because we're concerned about their safety. And I remember riding my bike to school as a fourth grader, so I don't know, maybe my parents just weren't that worried about me, but there's just sort of a cultural norm that's involved in all of this too. And then I think actual perceptions about safety and risk. So okay, let's go to Danny, and then we'll go to Michael.
Thanks. Yeah, so I have a comment and then a question for you guys. So my comment is, I made a comment in the map that I would just like to see moving forward, if as the city kind of rethinks expanding the bus routes, to think about expanding to trailheads. Because right now I know one example, at least in Wildwood, and the trailhead in Wildwood is a considerable distance from the closest bus stop. So just increasing people's ability to access the trails. And then the question that I have is, I heard that the city was planning on obtaining electric buses. I just wanted to know like the timeline on that.
Danny, we will have our first 2 light duty buses before the end of this year. Our first heavy duty buses, which are the ones that you normally see in service, should be arriving by 2024, and our full bus fleet, which is currently 11 buses, should be fully electrified by 2030.
Awesome. That's exciting. Thank you so much.
And good point about the access to the trails, because it can be an equity issue. If you have a car, you can park right at the trailhead. If you don't, you end up having to walk so far from the bus that maybe it negates the trip. So good. You're up, Michael and Gordon. Thank you for raising your hand. You'll be up next. You read my mind. I was going to see if you had anything to say, so hold tight, Michael.
Yeah, I was just going to say, on the survey about electric vehicles, there was a huge percentage, I think it was like 44% or something, said that cost was a factor. You got Tesla announced that they're going to introduce their $25,000 Tesla model coming out in 2022, so next year. And I really think that, when you see manufacturers like Tesla, putting out cars so cheaply, you're really, really going to see a huge increase in the number of people that buy these electric vehicles. And we need to be prepared for that by adding more charging stations and so forth. And I'm not sure that they necessarily need to be more spread out than they are, because they certainly are spread out pretty evenly throughout our city right now. I just think that we're going to start to see where these charging stations are going to be full, and you're going to go and you're going to have to wait your turn for them. And so somehow we just need to prepare for that, because when you see the $25,000 Tesla come out, you're going to see so many Teslas on the road. It's just going to be amazing to me, So that's all I say about that.
Yeah, well, it raises these other issues. Now you feel like you have an electric car, you can park it at the space and plug it in as long as you want. There's no like 2-hour maximum charging time. We've never conceived of somebody getting a parking ticket from, hogging the charger, but these sort of management regimes will need to come into place as we adapt. Okay, thank you for that,
Absolutely.
Gordon. Gordon, you're up.
Not there.
There we go.
Okay, keeps going on and off.
So yeah, on the electric car, I have an electric car and the solar panels, so I charge it at home, and I've almost never used a charger elsewhere because I really don't need to, because I bring it back, and put it on every night. So, but what I really want to get to is the bigger picture. I love all these ideas I've heard, and these are all things that we need to do and plan for. But that chart we had, where we saw that there's about 3 million miles driven daily to the city, and another 3 million miles driven out, but only 830,000 miles that are driven daily within the city. So looking at those figures, I'm thinking that there's 7 times more miles from greenhouse gases that are coming from commuting than there are from people driving around, taking their kids to school and doing all the local things. So my really concern is, how do we cut down on the commuting? And the best way I know is through the land use that we're working on. And we need to make more housing that's gets created that's really affordable, so that we can get a proportion of these people that are commuting in because they can't afford to live in Thousand Oaks to actually be able to live here. So anyhow, that ties in with the land use aspect of it.
It does. Yeah, very much so. And this is a little bit of the jobs housing balance, but also just having things closer to where you live in sort of this village environment. All right, we'll go to you, Cindy, and then I'm going to just see if any of the other folks, designated stakeholders, have anything they want to say before we wrap up. So
thank you. So one of the things that I'm really struggling with is what my son would call, I'm a noob at all of this stuff with with understanding the land use maps, the drafts, and then what I'm feeling like, and I don't know if it's correct or not, is that there's a bit of silos happening with conversations on transportation and environmental impact. And I don't quite yet understand how this conversation links to, or is there a public way that links to the draft land use plans and that feedback? So how will they be shuffled in, or as a public as a member of the public who's interested, is there an easy way to take the input from your maps and match it or pair it with the input on the land use draft maps? Do you see what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah.
It's a very tough way to, and for me, I'm speaking for myself, but I also know that others feel there's a level of anxiety that if we pick a draft map, like, I don't know, map 3 or whatever.
Yeah, right. Alternative 3, right.
Alternative 3, that we're somehow locked in without really understanding the environmental impact or accessibility impact, because what's happening here and in yours isn't quite overlaid on top yet. Can you help me reconcile that?
Excuse me. Maybe I can just say this, that like the good thing is that Sammy and I work for the same firm that's doing your general plan. And, in coordinating for this, Melissa, who's been very involved in the general plan, is, working with Sammy to come up with the maps and get us up to speed on the land use thing. So I think if we were in a different situation where you had some other consultants doing your general plan and we're doing the climate action plan, I would have a lot of anxiety, given that it's completely the opposite. That I think all of these comments that we're going to get on these maps will sort of directly be fed into the general plan process. And, our colleagues were excited that we were getting more public input to feed into their process. So I think in this case, it's kind of ideal. This is a little bit of like the holy grail of doing sort of the climate action planning concurrent with the general plan and having them inform each other, because usually they're ahead or behind each other. So I think this is actually set up to work well.
Sorry, just to follow up, how are members of the public going to understand how one informs the other? I know that it's nice that we have one agency that's supporting all of that, but how is that communicated to the public so we can make a decision? Mr. Ramey was in a meeting yesterday and he mentioned that the first thing is to pick an alternative map and then go from there. And I'm happy to hear this conversation happening, but it'd be nice to understand sort of an impact metrics before we pick a map.
Yeah, I hear you on that. and not being involved in that other process, I don't know, you know, I know generally what's going on, but I'm not in the details. So what I would assume is that these comments would find their way into the refinement of the alternatives, so that they've come up with these 3 alternatives and are, I think, getting input on them and analyzing them based on certain criteria. And that I would hope that all of this input on biking and walking and transit would demonstrate that, you know, alternative 1 is more consistent with this input, or alternative 3 is, or that alternative 3 would need to be modified. Like if alternative 3 is preferred in terms of the growth, types of growth that the city would like to see in terms of whatever it is, more housing, more affordable housing, jobs, you know, whatever, that it would also then be sort of adjusted to align with these other objectives related to mobility and access. Sounded like a lot of planner talk to me, Cindy, but that's ideally how it would work. I think Matt's looking for some direction, like we think this one is more us than that, and then you can go into the next set of evaluation to figure out how it would need to be refined. Maybe what you heard from Matt was like, pick one now, whereas I think he was like, if you could pick anything now, it would help us go through the next iterations of our evaluation, if that distinction makes sense.
Yeah, I would also say at the city, we're working closely with our general plan team. In fact, most of them are participating in this call tonight and listening to all your comments and hearing this. So it's not like we're 2 separate islands. There's a lot of cross-pollination of ideas and communications between us. So the idea is, you know, one of the, as Walker mentioned, we're in a great position where we're able to develop this climate action plan in parallel with the general plan, with the goal of them mutually supporting each other.
Yeah, and I just wanted a minute.
Helen, can I jump in? This is Kari. Hi, it's Kari Finley. I'm the planning manager. I'm also involved with the general plan update. And I just want to assure you that there are 4 of us on this call listening to what you're saying. And we are hearing it, and we are in constant contact with Helen and John, and working together on this. And so we're hearing what you're saying. And I just want to reassure you of that.
Thank you. And I was just going to take the last 5 seconds. Boy, you guys are on community calls. I'm sure you're working 15, 16, 18 hours a day, and I see it and appreciate it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just gonna, sorry, Rush, but I want to just make sure that some of the other of the designated stakeholders get a chance. So, excuse me, Rick, is there anything you would like to throw into the mix here?
Oh no, thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. So,
okay. All right. I think we have another Rick Fried. Did I get? Yes, 2 Ricks. How about Rick Fried?
No, but I agree. It's been a very fascinating thing. I'm going to suggest to the schools, I'm the school representative, that we try somehow to think about cutting down the idling at schools. It's a problem, and we've talked about it before, but let's see if it can go anywhere.
Yeah, okay, excellent. And then Mark Jacobson. I think I saw you out there, Mark. Anything you'd like to contribute?
All right, did it again. I needed to unmute myself.
Thought that might be happening.
I'm a super big advocate of cycling, and I would say cycling over walking. But then again, the idling and long lines of cars outside of the schools is just infuriating to me. And I guess kind of, you know, going back to the cycling and even the walking, I had mentioned in the chat, you know, if people don't feel safe, they're not going to do either. And so I think that's a big focus.
Yes, yeah, safety is really paramount in all of this. Right, any stakeholders that I missed or in the final moments want to chime in?
This is Joni. I just want to reiterate that, and Rick Fried, hi. And I love that you would look at that with the high schools, because it also is, as a cyclist, it's a problem for me because getting around those long lines of cars is scary, and it's just ludicrous to have all of that idling. So I think that's a great focus. But more than anything, I really want to say to the city, you guys are doing a phenomenal job. I'm really proud to be a part of this group. I'm really proud to be a City of Thousand Oaks resident. And the mapping tool was amazing. And I'm just so impressed with the access that you guys are providing. So thank you so much. This has just been great.
Okay, great. I have a minute and a half. Thomas, we haven't heard from you before, I don't think so. And then.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I may have missed this, but how are you calculating the emissions from cars?
So said simply, there's an emissions factor per mile. So there's a measurement of how many miles the cars drive. And then this comes from the state, from their resources board. And then there's a sort of an average emission factor per mile driven. And that's how you get the number.
And where do you get the miles driven from?
This generally will come from the county.
There's a transportation model that's based on the regional land use mapping. So it's based on zones and also it's the model was run by the county as part of their general plan, and so from that there's a knowledge or modeling of the overall miles from across cities, between cities, within cities, etc., for the whole region.
Okay.
And
so this isn't just looking at residential cars from residents of the city of Thousand Oaks. This is also looking at cars just driving through the city.
Yes.
Well, no. So actually, this. So yeah, sorry, Helen. But the way it works is the city gets charged with all the trips inside the city. Half of the trips that start in the city and go away, and half of the trips that start somewhere else and come into the city. So this is kind of the agreed upon methodology. And we could debate back and forth whether it's the right methodology, but it tells us the important story, which is like most of your emissions are related to people driving their cars in your big pie chart. And then we need to figure out ways to reduce those emissions. So I think if it can give us sort of the right direction, that's as important as being like 100% accurate on the nose. Although, these traffic engineers will tell you they have high levels of precision in doing it. I think it's more important to tell us where we need to focus our attention.
Thank you.
Okay. RL, do you still, I saw you waving. Yes.
Two things. First off, I've dropped this in the chat, but I'd like to work with anybody in terms of reducing emissions around schools. 50% of this is simply educating parents on what children could be expected to do in terms of walking and making sure that parents feel safe about their children walking safely. And I'd love to work with anybody on this because I'm a frustrated mom who got into climate change.
Oh no, I think we lost her right at the origin story. RL, I don't know if you can hear us, but you've frozen up. Okay.
We take Arash's question real quick and then see if RL comes back on and close out.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Okay, last question, and we'll see if RL comes back. Good idea, John. Okay, Arash.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to kind of ask this question out loud that Shannon posted in the chat. Is there a date that we should all keep on our calendars where we need to show up and persuade the city council to vote on these things in the way we think is appropriate, and where we're supposed to bring out our like-minded residents to do so? That's the question.
An excellent intention. I don't know what the date is when, but we'll see what.
Or how would we find out what the date is when it eventually is?
We'll make sure you know. When do you think?
So we have two more meetings coming up with this group of this topic focused. The next one's March 24th. Will be focused on energy, and we'll send these out. The one following that's April 28th, and that's on solid waste, water, recycling.
Helen, I think the question is more, I'd posted something related to the general plan and the adoption of the land use alternatives. So perhaps somebody from the CDD side could share maybe the link to their page, which will host everything.
Okay, I was just going to say, so as far as the climate action plan, we're going to be posting our strategies and having a big public meeting at the beginning of the summer. So that would be an excellent time for everybody to, submit comments back. But also then it's likely to go to council towards the end of this year. We don't have the date for that, but certainly when it starts to go to council is when council members should hear from you, if not before, really anytime. But as far as the general plan, yes, I don't know if Kari's still there or Michael wants a comment on input for the general plan.
Yes, I'm sorry, I missed the question. This general, how do you provide input on the general plan? Is that the question? Because we would love to hear from all of you.
Michael, I had posted something earlier saying that it's very important for the council to hear related to everybody's ideas about kind of road diets, reduction, density, and the ideas that have been brought up here, and that you're going to be going to council sometime in May. And so those voices would be important to be heard at that time.
Yes, so what we're seeking input on right now is, it's been mentioned a few times tonight, but the land use alternatives, which are how the city is going to develop over the next 25 years, where different land uses are going to go and what density those uses will be built at. So not explicitly transportation, but definitely closely related to transportation, since land use and transportation are definitely intertwined with one another. So I would encourage all of you to take a look, and we'll put our website up in the chat, and take a look at what's available now. And we have a survey out now until March 15th, and now is the opportunity to make your voice heard. We will be having further conversations later in the summer about some other topics in the general plan, which would include transportation, and there'll be more discussion at that time about the linkage between the general plan and the SEAP. So definitely a lot more to come on that. But again, I would encourage you now to take a look at what we're seeking comments on now, and use this opportunity to give your input.
Okay, great. I'll just say thanks to everyone and hand it back to Helen.
Okay, I'll just wrap up here with a couple of closing closing slides with dates on. So we're, from this point, we're going to be, as I mentioned, we're going to be having the next two meetings. And, this is the Facebook Live for people who want to add comments or access the map. That will be on our climate action page, and it'll be available now through March 10th for anybody who'd like to input their ideas. These are the upcoming meetings of this format over the next 2 months. Again, we'll post information to that same website and also distribute it to all the registered participants here. And following that, they're going to be the public meeting with all of the strategies that have been discussed. So with that, thank you so much for joining us this evening. As always, feel free to email us at gogreen@toaks.org, and find that email address also on our climate action page. I think that's it. Anything else, John, that you wanted to add? No, I did post a link to the map in the links here. So if somebody's just motivated and want to jump into it, they can do that now, but I will also email it out tomorrow along with some other links to some of the items we've discussed today. So thanks, everyone. Okay. And for sure, we will share the maps with the general plan folks also, so it's not isolated just to the climate action plan. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great evening.